Alright, so this is a video on terrains using the default terrain component in Unity. This video is going to be split into kind of three parts. First, we're going to talk about the component and its settings and how to configure everything that you might want to. Then we're going to talk about painting the terrain, and then we'll talk about manipulating and displacing the terrain itself, moving it up and down, making mountains and other such things. So I'll try to timestamp it, so maybe in the little bar down here somewhere below, I don't know where the camera is, will be a couple of timestamps so that you can skip this boring intro part, but you really should, if you're using a terrain, know what its components do. So let's get started. And the first thing you need to be able to do, this is a pretty fresh project, is to make a terrain, which is under 3D objects by right-clicking in the hierarchy and making a terrain. First thing you'll notice is that this terrain is colossal. And this is why I mentioned that you should know what your settings do, because you'll almost always want to make this smaller, because this is I believe it starts as 1,000,000 square Unity units or meters, which is a really huge space for a terrain. By default here you have the terrain component, which contains a terrain collider. This lets you change the physics material on the terrain itself, make it a little bit less bouncy usually. Terrains are usually dirt and grass and other such things that aren't terribly bouncy, but this is up to you. You can set your physics material. Your data is stored in this new terrain because I haven't named this terrain or anything like that. And you can choose whether your trees, which includes things like rocks and grass sometimes, have colliders. We're going to go right to left for the most part here. On the right here is terrain settings. This lets you connect terrains, have reflection probes, determine if it needs shadows. You might want to turn these off if it's a terrain for a mobile game of some sort. Sometimes you want no terrain shadows for VR, but make your own decisions on your graphical quality on that. You can draw trees, you can turn these things on and off, usually to save yourself the trouble in the editor, as well as increase detail, distance, your billboard, your fade length, and your maximum mesh trees. If you are adding trees or other details, and for whatever reason it's going really slowly, you'll want to lower these probably below their defaults here. This computer is pretty strong. I tend to always keep this all the way up, no matter what. You got wind settings here. This is totally up to you, your trees, and your grass. Those settings, those things you just play with. This grass tint I tend to use a lot because I don't like the default tint at all. So play with that if you like, with your grass. So this is what really matters when you're first starting out, is width, length, and height. Height is the maximum height of this terrain. 600 is huge. It's probably all the way up here, possibly more. So this is always a fine value. But I tend to shrink my terrains to work with them a little bit better, at least to demonstrate. I'm going to make this just 100 by 100. This really depends on your game's use. If you have a terrain that's this size, you'll probably use the outside to kind of hide your boundaries and lift it all the way up like games usually do. Again, this tutorial is not really on that. It's on the basics, not necessarily on the realism here. I'm sure somebody else has done that, or I could do it later. So very low, I tend to keep this pretty much on high all the time for the light mappings. The terrain looks really nice. But right now, this is a really boring set of squares, so let's make this look better. Next over here is paint details. We should probably skip over a little bit. I know I said I was going to go right to left, but it kind of makes a little bit less sense. Let's go to all the way on the left for neighbor terrains, because this is almost instant. This lets you plug in new terrains. This helps you make seamless terrains without having to have one that's separate from another, so that you have to slowly smooth everything out and do all of that manually. No, you kind of just make them all the same terrain for the most part. This helps hide your seams and increase the size of your terrains without interfering in other pieces of your level. What people usually care the most about is this paint texture and raise or lower terrain, sometimes set height and smooth. Let's start with painting this. We can raise or lower in the third section later on in this section, in this video. Look, I'm not a professional. Well, I am a professional, but I'm not a professional video maker. As you can see, I don't have any of those fancy graphics and that kind of stuff. So to paint a texture on this, we will need to create a terrain layer. This is not to be confused with a brush. So when you're thinking about, say, painting, real painting, you have paint and you have a brush. The brush is the conformation or shape of how you're putting on the paint. So I can put this on as a star pattern. This will be a little bit more evident in a moment. But don't confuse brush with paint. Terrain layers are in fact your paint. So we don't have anything downloaded by default for a new terrain layer. So this would be your grass, your dirt, your rock, anything else that you would want outside. So what we need to do is go get something. I'm going to use my old standby here, ambient CG, and we're just going to grab the grass that I use in almost every project. I'm not going to really go into the details here on these. You should know that PNG files support transparency, JPG or JPEG files don't. So if your file doesn't have any transparency, just go with the JPEG. And over about 4 years, every semester, I've asked my class which one looks better and has the best looks to file size ratio, and it is always 2K. So we're going to download this nice 2K file. You'll have to extract it. And we've got this here. We're just going to grab these top 6 files. Really, for a terrain, we don't need all of them. We'll discuss that in a moment, but you don't need the USDA, the USDC, or this preview file for what we're doing here. I'm just going to plonk these right down into this folder here so I can use them a little bit better. I would like another material as well, so I'm going to search for some, I don't know, dirt. We'll grab some nice looking dirt. Grab this one, it's got some nice leaves in it. Probably blend a little bit better. And we will go ahead and extract. And grab these same files here. We'll discuss these in a moment. So our leaves are ground 42, and this is ground 37 here. Just something to remember when you're downloading these. I would generally recommend renaming these and putting them into separate files. Your project organization is pretty much your own, so figure out how to keep track of everything. We're going to create a new layer. That layer starts with your color map. So, and it by default throws your color map on the terrain all over. But let's take a look at this terrain layer a little bit further. It does have support for a normal map, so you can drag that in. You may need to go in and mark it as a normal map if it gives you a warning. Let's just do that with all 4 of these right off the bat here to save some time. It is imported as normal map. Unity, this might not go away. That's okay. You can really see the difference when you're adding and removing this normal map though. So let's take a look here. You can really see a dramatic change in the file. So your normal map, oh, I'm using the wrong one. So you can see that your normal map adds your depth here. Pretty standard stuff. Let's see if one of these looks better than the other. One is marked as DirectX, the other is OpenGL. I tend to use the DX one, but if you're on a Mac, you might need to use a GL one. I'm not quite sure. Let's see. There's a normal scale here, so you can increase kind of the drama on the ground. So if you have, say, a scene at night, you might want to increase your normal scale. I think for this texture, 1.5 looks pretty nice. Nice balance of shadowing. Because it's awfully bright out here because of this directional light. If you even increase, you wouldn't. So if we had something at night, it's on the default. Oh, sorry about the phone. You might want to increase this to give your user a little bit more visual kind of depth on these for darker scenes. I think for the most part this looks fine, and I'm going to keep this right here for now. So the next thing that we need to do is determine our metallic and smoothness values. Grass isn't metallic and it's not very specular for this material. You're probably just going to keep this at 0, 0. If you have something like marble, it will be more smooth and a little bit metal. If you have something like granite, you'll probably be decently smooth and not metal at all. Those things you can look at physically based rendering websites like Physically Based and determine your own thoughts on that. So you can pretty see the tiling here on these tiling settings pretty strongly. I'm not a huge fan. I also don't tend to use this mask map, but you absolutely can. Metallism, AO, height, and smoothness, that's kind of out of the purview for this basics. But if we wanted this tiling to become a little bit less obvious, we could make this smaller or larger. So if we're down here, this is probably too big. The sticks are going to look too large. So we're only going to be about this tall, ultimately. But if we bring it down, it really isn't so bad to the default 2x2, or even the 1x1, but this can make the sticks look too small. I think this is probably fine. If you're outside and you're looking on the ground, this is approximately what you would see. Sticks of about this length, 4 to 6 inches here. You wouldn't be seeing it from this kinds of bird's eye view, and if you are, you should be thinking about some other considerations, like making them much bigger, or doing significantly more blending than we are for this. So let's talk about that blending. Next thing we need to blend is something to blend with. And we're going to grab this new ground texture here, and I'm going to modify it with its normal map as we determined. And let's see how this goes. So like I said, the brush is your brush, your terrain layer is your paint. So let's paint. I have a tendency to keep the opacity at extremely low levels while painting. Not quite this low, but you can see even at 2, and this goes all the way up to 100, you're painting on this really fast. You're making a dramatic change. This isn't blending, this is transforming. See how 1 does? I might be able to get away with 1 if I'm just clicking. So this is me clicking very gradually, and you can see the difference pretty much right away on this corner that I didn't touch. And over here, we have a much dirtier example. Patch this up a little bit more. So we got a blending of these two textures. You can see the strong brown with the leaves. You can see the grass is more normal over here. This will make a little bit more sense after we go over the height, and then I'll come back to this and bring it all together. That seems like what a video would do. I'm a teacher, not a video maker. So let's talk about raising and lowering the terrain, as well as smooth height and set height. Raise or lower terrain gives you this kind of brush that allows you to make, let's say, molehills. You can spend some time and make it a little bit larger so that we've got these kind of techniques. But right now, this looks like I've stamped all over the ground, and it looks awful. So I'm going to do that for a little bit so that I can prove a point here. We're going to have a nice little mountaintop here. I'll probably raise the opacity a little bit. You can see I'm kind of doing it on the sides here. I'd also like some more randomness pretty much all over this. So I'm going to increase the brush size, not by that much. I'm going to increase this brush size and add that little bit of randomness. You can see these kinds of discs here, but we're going to get rid of them slowly as don't worry about those hard contrasts quite yet. We will make this look better in a moment. So this looks like a decent terrain. You could be, you know, down here, going up these kind of hills. It's pretty extreme. So what we do to make this a little bit less extreme is that smooth height. And we can really raise the opacity on this. Not by that much. And it starts to kind of melt the terrain into itself and into the other pieces close to it. So if I bring this all the way up to demonstrate, you can really see this melt away. If that's too much, I would probably do some small clicks all around the terrain. Randomness is really helpful when making the terrain. Nature is constantly random. So if I'm walking around, there could be this little hill and valley. There's kind of still a lot going on here. Let's melt the whole thing. Melt and melt and melt. And see if this helps. This would make a lot more sense, kind of to my eye, but we see a lot more places that are smaller. And if I want something flat to make it a little bit more realistic, we can instead use set height. So we're going to set the height to say 2 and see what it decides to do. Melts the whole thing all the way away. So we're going to need a smaller brush. Let's make the height say 10, see what happens. Still not quite good enough. We're making the R is a little bit higher. Let's call it 12. Take a nice small brush. We can kind of carve this out in a more meaningful way, if that's something that you need to do to your terrain. It's still a little low. So if we wanted to have something like a bridge coming across here, you absolutely can. Makes the whole thing a little bit easier to work with. You can also have this kind of plateau, but nothing is ever really flat. So if you're going to do something like this, ultimately you are eventually going to have to make these kind of divots that we talked about here. So I don't tend to use set height terribly often, mostly on things like RTS games and other things that need that kind of discrete height. Let's see what else we can do here. So let's talk a little bit more about that blending from before. Let's bring everything together. Let's go back to paint. We've got our second texture. Where would we generally expect? The opacity is way too high again. I think we have it on 1. You'd probably expect more dirt to be in divots here. Probably not quite that strong. But I'm just going to kind of randomly paint all around, get a little bit of brown on pretty much everything here, have that nice blending effect, and have it be stronger on these lower lying areas here, where leaves would tend to fall and coalesce. Kind of channel your inner Bob Ross when you're working with terrain painting and that kind of thing. On this mountain, I think we should probably grab a rock texture of some sort, something nice and strong. Maybe something like this. Oh, accidentally downloaded the 1K version. Let's grab the 2K one so we're stylistically consistent. Do that same extraction. I'm just going to import the 2 files I care about this time. Let's add that last terrain layer. I always like to have at least 3. in my scenes. Again, we're going to increase that smoothness. I'm going to start it at 0.5. We'll see how it works. I really want this mountain to have that kind of strong associated texture with it. So especially on the more dramatic sides where grass would tend not to grow, I'm going to put this really nice and strong. Not quite that strong. We're just going to blend this all over. Again, very Bob Ross here. Have that nice kind of platinum. I don't even know what this is supposed to be, this rock. Could even do a little bit on some of these tops here. Maybe even like that, just a smidge. We can add that kind of clicking all over the place to add a little bit of rocky terrain. And this time I'm going to focus more towards where the strong rock is. And I'm not really going to put it very many other places here. We're going to keep that nice blending. And I'm going to patter out on that last nice grass texture, the original texture. Then I just go over the whole thing, clicking all over the place to make a nice strong texture. That's a little too bright. And then we keep it all like this. So if you're walking around, you're looking at this is all grass here. Then we've got a little bit more of this rock face. And as we come up to this nice strong rock texture with a little bit of grass or maybe moss, your viewers usually won't notice the difference. This is the kind of thing that you can get the absolute basics. You can spend hours and hours and hours making a really nice terrain, but this is a video on the basics, and that really just comes with practice. So I hope this helped you get through the rest of terrain. We'll talk about painting trees next time, painting details, maybe, and then we can also show you what this looks like. So I can show you what that kind of blending looks to be. Obviously there's some differences here, but it really does try. So Create Neighboring Terrains isn't useless, but I don't think I've ever used it before. It's another consideration that you might have. So take a look at everything, play, that's the best way to get better, and hope this helped.